Good afternoon, all you Uncoders out there. I am the Uncoder, back for another episode on Unqork's Twitch channel. So today, if you can tell from my background, I have to point the correct direction, and you might have seen us promote this throughout the day. We're going to be talking about chatbots, specifically AWS's chatbot called Lex, and how that can be tied into Unqork. So a few weeks ago, we talked about AWS and we showed how you can use Unqork to integrate with S3, SQS, Lambda. If you saw Coffee and No Code with myself and our CEO Gary a couple weeks ago, we showed integrations with Recognition, their image parsing library or service. So then, we're just continuing down this road of integrating with every product or service that we think our customers would be interested in and want to use. And we came across Lex. So again, chatbots, baked in some NLP and things like that to obviously understand the things that users are entering for you. But we figure we can make it better, right? Because you can make everything better with a codeless architecture and with Unqork. So going to show you a little bit of Lex, and then we're going to show you what we did with Unqork on top of it, which is effectively building one UI that could be the UI for every Lex bot in the world, every chat bot, and a very smart UI that really just helps the user enter the correct information that the chat bot is looking for. So with that said, let's just dive right in. See how fast we can blow through this stuff. Not too fast. I hope you get all the good stuff out of it. So let's get my screen up, my screen share up. Boom. Okay, there it is. So the first thing we're going to just show here is Lex, right? So AWS has an interface in their console to create the bots through a UI and go from there. Okay. So the bot that I'm using for this example is one of the sample bots that AWS will give you, and it's called the Book a Trip bot, right? So the first thing you do is create a bot to serve, any number of intents, as you can see on my screen, right? So the overall bot is responsible for booking aspects of a trip. However, the bot can handle different prompts or what AWS calls intents. Like what do you intend to do with this bot? So the built-in intents to the bot that we're going to be using are you can book a car or you can book a hotel. So that's the two intents. I like the book a hotel better because I'm a fan of public transportation. So we're going to go with book a hotel. Okay, so now I have my intent defined as book a hotel. It's called a hotel. Brief description says you're going to book a hotel. And then within the intent, the next thing you define are what are called slots. So slots are the pieces of information that you need to fulfill the intent. So if I'm going to book a hotel, what information does the chatbot need to get from the user in order to go ahead and actually book it, or provide them a list of potential hotels, or just log a request to book a hotel in some system, which can then be picked up by either some other automated process or even a user who then might reach out to the person. So the bot that we are using here has 4 intents in it. Where are you going to go? When do you want to check in? How many nights do you want to stay there? And then what type of room do you want? Now, each slot type comes with its own configuration, right? You might also, one thing I jumped over, this is an English version of the bot, right? So AWS supports multiple languages. For this demonstration, both the bot in AWS as well as how we're leveraging it on Unqork, we're just going to use the English US, so the N_US, if you're familiar with the locale codes used in software development. The NUS language is what we're going to use here. Okay, so everything is obviously in English, but you can set this up per language. Pretty cool. Right. So you can say whether or not the intent is required. Like, of course, if you're going to book a hotel, you need to know where the person wants to go, right? You give it the name of what it is. All right. This is like a property ID. So it's the location. And then you can define the type of data, right? The data type. So AWS comes with a number of built-in data types for things, as you can see here, as well as the ability to define custom types. All right. So what they did was they gave the example where, okay, here's 3 built-in types: a city, a date, and a number, and then a custom type, which is room values. And room values is effectively room type values. That is just a list of all the possible room types. So it's basically select from king, queen, or deluxe, as you'll see in a second. Oh, what? You already see it right there, right? It's written on the screen. So those are the room types that Amazon set up. So this would be effectively you're picking one of those three. Okay. So that's really it. And then finally, at the end, when you're done, you could say, all right, as you can see here, all right, I have you down for X number of nights and the location. So you can like inject dynamically the values that you collected from the user. And then you ask them whether or not they want to do it, which is simply just, yep, go ahead. No, don't do it. Right. Cool. So we've got this bot, but this is no good to me, right? Like no one can use my bot. This is just my configuration of my bot. Of course, I need to build some kind of a UI that a user is going to go in and talk to the bot. So obviously that's usually some button in the bottom right corner that looks like a little chat bubble. You click it, there's your UI, right? And that's talking to the bot. So that could be very complicated to do. And also there's tons and different technologies you might want to do it in. You might want to have it on the web. You might want to have it in mobile. You might want to have it embedded elsewhere, so on and so forth. So, the implementation of the bot ends up being really complex, right? But the beautiful thing about codeless architecture is if we can represent this bot and how to interact with this bot in a codeless manner, in that codeless definition, then we could render a UI of that bot really anywhere that we want, right? So not surprisingly, I'm going to show you rendering it inside of Unqork's UI. But again, because it is wrapped in codeless, it then becomes far more portable in terms of where you'd want to deploy this bot and how you'd want to render this bot. Okay. So let's hop over to Unqork now. So what we did here is we set up a bunch of endpoints that you can talk to for the bot, many of which are going to be necessary throughout the flow, right? So we have everything from list the bots. So tell me what bots are out there, right? So this again is going back to thinking about our last conversation around how we're, integrating with all these AWS services, building what I'm like to call the codeless SDK for AWS, right? If you go and you say AWS SDK, you're going to go in here and you say, okay, well, I can grab a JavaScript SDK. I can grab a Ruby SDK. I can grab, a React SDK, whatever it is. You can grab their existing SDKs, but those are all code SDKs, right? What about a codeless SDK? And let's just take a step back around SDK. I don't know, we talked a ton about SDKs on here. Many of you are probably familiar with them, software development kit. So it's effectively a library of code that you can give, that AWS, for example, here gives to developers to simplify building against their products and services. So kind of wrapping all the API calls that are necessary, handling authentication, and giving you simple methods that you can execute in code to leverage the AWS. So we're doing the same thing in codeless. Like, how can we take the nitty gritty bolts of getting listing the bots? We don't want our users have to worry about, okay, well, what's the endpoint of list bots and what's the response going to look like? Do I need to shape the response and the request and the response, right? So here it is. This is again building out that codeless SDK for AWS. So we have the ability, okay, we're going to list bots. Then we're going to list what intents exist in the bot. Then we're going to list what slots are available for each intent. We're going to list the types of slots. So that would be those things we talked about before, the Amazon city, the Amazon date and number, or a custom slot such as room values, right? Which is going to be important as we go through as I showed the development. And then things like recognized text. So this is how you send whatever the user enters back to Lex for it to figure out, did they answer my question, and so on and so forth. So just front dooring a bunch of the APIs that are necessary to kind of make a very dynamic bot, right? So now let's just show what this looks like on the front end, and forgive any like minor UI things here, but let's just, think about the functionality more than anything, okay? So what happens here? So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna choose which bot I want to talk to. Now, I only have one bot set up, so there's only one bot here. But the idea being this is a dynamic UI that is built based on the bots that you are plugging into it. So in theory, I could build more bots and put more bots in this list and talk to any of them. Okay. So I'm going to choose my book trip bot. So this is going to go. And the first thing this does, and I'll open up the config in the back too, just to also show you, as with everything else that the Uncoder does, there's no code here. There's a little bit of CSS, and I'll show you why. But again, this is just Unqork. So what we do here is we say, okay, well, you told me what bot you want to get. So obviously, the first thing we do is say, well, what bots are out there, right? And then when you've selected a bot, Well, then we say, okay, well, now we know your bot. Let's go get information about that bot. Well, the description of the bot is book a trip. So we're just going to put the description in there. Jumping back, let's go back to the bot for a second, right? If I go back to my book trip bot, book a trip, right? Cool. So the next thing is, what is your intent, right? What do you want to do with this bot? So that goes back to the intents where I'm basically hitting Amazon's API here and I'm querying back all the intents. Now, one thing you'll notice is there's a book a car and book a hotel intent, as well as what's called a fallback intent. You'll notice that I don't have fallback intent as an option here because when you're building, bot UIs with this, you don't have to worry in a sense about fallbacks as much, right? Because the idea of this fallback intent, as you can see here, the default intent when no other intent matches, right? So let's pretend that you're interfacing with this bot by just typing in an open text area. You might, and the options are book a car, book a hotel, and you say book a flight. Well, normally that would trigger the fallback intent because there is no intent set up around booking a flight. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, let's just make sure the user doesn't ask to do something that the bot can't do and just tell them what the bot can do, right? The bot can book you a hotel and the bot can book you a car. So now we're going to just streamline and kind of avoid bad user experience of having to fall back if you don't match. All right. So if we go to book a hotel now, so what is this going to do? So what this basically does is this sends book a hotel. Because again, normally it would be a text area and I would type in, the bot would say, how can I help you? And I would type in book a hotel. And then it would start down that intent. So all I really did was say, okay, I'm going to let you pick from a dropdown. And then I'm going to use the value of the dropdown to effectively be that first message that you type in. Okay, so I'm now saying I took the book a hotel. I'm saying book a hotel, which means that the book hotel intent is satisfied. Right, so now we're in book a hotel. Okay, so now as we look through book a hotel, what you'll see down here are the slots. Right, so the first thing it says, the first slot configured is what city will you be staying in. Okay, it's required and it's of type Amazon city. Okay, and here's the prompt, which you'll see obviously is what's written here. Now, again, I don't want to just give you, and when I first built this, I just did a blank text area and I leveraged the natural language processing that's inside of it to type, NYC or just or New York, right? Test variations, and it's, it tries to figure those out. But again, we don't need to do that. So what did we do? We said, okay, well, you want a city. So what is the Unqork component that is best suited for arriving at a city? Okay, and what we chose here was the address component because Unqork's address component allows you to search as you type, right? And then it's going to search, so you're going to pick the right city, you're going to make sure it's spelled correctly, so on and so on and so on, and that it's actually a city, in Google Maps, which obviously has every city out there, right? So if I type in Chicago, cool. I can type in Denver, cool, right? So I'm getting the city. Now when I hit send, it's going to send Denver. All right, and now it's asking me the next question was, what day do you want to check in? Now, before I dig into this and the next thing, let's just let's just talk through it, right? So the next thing says, okay, but now what day do you want to check in? Now, that down here was a date, right? So what, of course, do? We give you a date picker in Unqork, right? We can make you pick a date. So I'm going tomorrow, right? So I'm going to check in tomorrow. So I'm going to send that. Cool. And now it says, how many nights will you be staying? Well, okay, obviously, how many nights is an integer. So we don't want people to type letters. I'm trying to type letters right now. And of course, it's not accepting it because Unqork's component validation is active here as well, right? So I can only choose to put in a number. So there it is. I'm going to stay for 3 nights. I'm going to send that to the bot. And now it says, what type of room would you like? A queen, king, or deluxe? Now, as I said before, for this custom type, you can create a list of all the acceptable values being queen, king, or deluxe. So what does that sound like? Well, that sounds to me like a dropdown. Okay, so here's now a dropdown of the values that I configured or Amazon configured inside. So just to show real quick, so if I go to prompt a room type, advanced options, and over here, it's room type values, view slot details. And of course, you could see here, these are the possible values, right? So I'm just taking a list of the the values that are accepted and just letting the person choose. So again, you don't have to worry about the person typing in double, a double room, which is a very common term for a room in Europe. So maybe if this was NUK, we would choose double instead of queen. But we don't have to worry about someone typing in double if they really want to book a queen room in the United States. Right. So we're gonna force that. So then I'm gonna say, okay, well, I'm a big guy, 6'4", and I like to sleep diagonally. So let me give myself a king and let me hit send. All right. So now I said, okay, cool. Well, I have you down for a 3-night stay in Denver starting 2/10/23. Shall I book the reservation? Sure. Let's book the reservation. So this is where I just say, okay, you can type yes or no. In reality, maybe I should have configured like a radio button of yes or no, but whatever. Let them type them in yes and no. I don't think people can screw that up. Right. And what do I get back? So it says, cool, your reservation's confirmed. And I get a link to an Unqork module. And I pulled that up and bam, there's all the information I captured, right? But it's actually more than just the information I captured. Okay. So for example, here the location was Denver. Got it. The check-in date is 2/10. We didn't ask for the check-out date, right? We just said the bot told me it was a 3-night thing, right? But if you're going to go into a system and actually do that, you really want to physically press, I'm going from 2:10, check in 2:10, check out 2:13, right? So let's just do the math and let's say, hey, let's add 3 days to this. Voila. So that's a night of the 10th. And yeah, that's 3 nights. Cool. And then room type is king. And then the price, this is a made up price, but basically we just said, hey, let's assume a hotel room is $150 a night. So we're going to calculate the price for them. And we're going to say that for 3 nights at $150 a night, this is going to cost you $450. Now this data lives in Unqork, okay. Whereas this whole bot was run inside of this whole bot was set up in Amazon. So the last thing I'm going to show is, well, how the heck do we get this data in Unqork? But before that, let's go back to this module and let's talk a little more about how we were able to show specific components based on the type of data that the Lex bot was expecting the user to enter. Okay. So as I said here, this is just a bunch of setup work. We're going to get the bot. We're going to get its aliases because that has to do with how Lex deploys the bots. It allows you to basically build a bot and create an alias for the bot. And then you can swap out what version of the bot is pointing to which alias. So it just helps you do like really quick deployments. Like let's say I build a new version of the bot and I assign it to a certain alias. I find out it breaks. Well, then I just assign the old version to the alias and I'm done. Right. So a great way to deploy multiple versions of the bot and so on and so forth. So that's why there's this thing of get the alias, right? Because that's really, that's what I'm using. That's what some of the API calls in Lex expect, or aliases versus the bot ID. Because again, the bot can have multiple versions. So which alias is the one you're actually working with? And we get back the intents, right? And then, this is what you saw at the top. We have the description. So based on the description of the bot, we just dynamically populate this page in it, and then based on the intents, we'll dynamically do the drop down, right? So all the intents is doing is it's basically sort of a little data workflow here, and it says, hey, filter back fallback intent. I don't want that one, right? Where I showed you we don't need the fallback intent anymore because we're not going to fall back. We're only going to fall forward, right? Okay, so after that, then comes the conversation. Okay, so this is not as Lex related, but I thought it was a fun thing to do in Unqork. So I don't know about you, but like this kind of looks like a text message chain, right? A rounded edge bubble on the right when you talk, a rounded edged bubble on the left when the whoever you're talking to talks, be that your friend, family, colleague, chatbot, right? So this is kind of that, right? And then colored differently, of course. Okay, so this looks to me a little bit like a text message chain or a chatbot chain, right? So how the heck did we do this, right? So this over here is actually a uniform grid in Unqork, where a uniform grid is, especially with this simple loop option that's has existed for the last couple months, has become one of my favorite components to do UIs. Right? Because oftentimes you have to kind of like loop over data and show that data, right? And a lot of times people put that in grids and just using one of the many awesome grids that Unqork has. But sometimes the UI that you want is going to be pretty bespoke and not really gritty, right? So what the uniform grid simple loop allows you to do is say, hey, just loop over a set of data and just render out that data inside of whatever components are in the grid, right? So what do I have inside the grid? I have a column component, and then I have two fields. I have a text field called text bot, which I've hid the label and marked as read only. And I also have a text field called user, where I've hid the label and did a read only. Okay. So then what happens is each and every time either the user or the bot sends some text or needs to have text, what I basically do is in the configuration, well, I won't even show it. Whenever I log the data, I just basically say, hey, was it the bot who did it? If so, output it to the text bot field inside of the array of conversations. And if it's a text, if the user said it, well, then it goes in this field, right? So if you look at the data that sits behind the UG conversations, right? If we look at this data, here's my conversation. The first thing that happened is, well, the user said something, the bot said nothing. Then the bot said something and the user said nothing. Then the user said something and the bot said something, right? So you can see how depending on whose text it is, we're just writing it to a different property within this array. So then that it's going to get rendered on the appropriate side. Okay. Now, and then this is where my CSS comes in, where I say one of two things. The first thing is I say, okay, we'll style them, round their corners, put some border, get some padding, right? And then I say, well, if it's the text user, then make the background one color. If it's the text bot, make the background another color. And then this was a fun one where I said, basically, since it's always going to alternate between me and the bot, me and the bot, me and the bot, me and the bot, I can simply say, hey, for each odd numbered one, hide the bot, right? So basically, this is the first one. So hide the bot in the first row. And this is the second one. So it's an even number. So hide the user in the second row, right? So it just basically, so using a little bit of basic CSS, I think you've seen this nth child. If you've written CSS, guarantee you've written some nth child logic or selector at some point in your time. So that's all I'm doing is I'm saying, based on whether it's odd or even, hide the person who's really not talking at that point. Now, of course, this model breaks down if there is a bot where you get two messages from the bot and one message from the user, two messages from the user. But again, using Unqork and really driving that UI with those, accurate components and the right components, you shouldn't really need a lot of those double questions. And, if that were the case, we'll come up with another solution. Okay. All right, cool. So that's how I rendered my conversation back and forth. It was just a uniform grid and some CSS. And then now comes the point where it's like, all right, I got to respond to the user. Okay. So what you'll see down here is you'll see a text field. This text field is actually, so this was the original text field that I was using to just capture freeform text from the user. I've since hidden it, but I'm still using it. I'm still using it to store the data that I'm actually going to send to AWS, and I'll show you what that means in a second, right? So in order to render that component, the accurate component, what am I doing? Well, what I'm doing is I'm using a feature of Unqork called dynamic refresh. Okay, I think I've shown this one on Twitch before because it's relatively new and unlocks a ton of really cool use cases. But what it basically allows you to do is allows you to take any Unqork module JSON, so like an array of the component JSON, so the codeless definition, the JSON, take any bit of codeless module JSON and render that inside of a panel. So that could be an entire module. It could be just a few components, or in reality, it could just be one single component. So that's what we're doing here. We are going to dynamically refresh this panel with whatever component makes sense. And that's the component that I kept seeing. The dropdown for room types, the date picker for check-in date. Okay. So that's, we're going to dynamically drop in. Now, the question becomes, how do we know what to render. How do we know which component belongs there, right? So basically, what's going on in that is so this is me sending the text. So this is the call where I send the text to the user, right? So I'm going to invoke my recognized text module, and I'm going to send it some text. I'm going to tell it what bot I'm talking to, of course, right? But this is the text I'm going to send. When the text gets sent to Lex, they send you back the payload that you get back basically tells you, well, did the response work? Yes or no? Like, was it a valid response? Again, by using this guided UI of specific components. And I'll just jump back up to book a car so we can start from the top again because I'm on my network open here. Book a car, right? So when it told me, so I go here and I'll put in, we're going to book it in Chicago this time. Now, here we go. So this is me sending the text to Lex. Okay, so you can see in the payload, I sent Chicago to this bot. And what I get back is the next thing to ask them, what day do you want to start? Okay, because it's like, cool, you nailed that intent. I've got my slot for the city. So the next thing you need to do is ask them for what date. Okay, so that's what I have here, right? What day do you want to start your rental? Which comes right out of the response from the last text that I sent. The next thing that we look at is over here. Okay, so this is starting to give you some more of that metadata around what type of data you're going to get back, right? So I'm going to ask you the question, what day do you want to start your rental? And then AWS Lex tells us that this question is going to fill in this slot, the pickup date slot, right? So if we go back to book a car, or when we go back to, it's the first time we're going to be showing you book a car. But if we book a car, back to intents lists, leave. If we go back to book a car and we go down to slots, right? Pickup date is an Amazon date. So this is what we're getting back. So it's telling us, cool, nailed that slot. Now go to the next slot. Okay. So it's telling me that you're going to elicit a slot. So it's like, hey, elicit some feedback that's going to fill this slot. And the slot you got to fill is pickup date. So what we then are able to do is we're able to go in to our slots. Okay. Let me do it again. We go into our slot data and intent slots, slot summaries, date to start the rental, right? And so here's more of that information, right? So this here is, so basically we say, okay, they want pickup date. So let's go back and I'll just show it down here. Because this is the same data, right? Just in a nicer, I outputted the slot summaries property of my API call to say, hey, get me all the slots available for the current intent. So book car, go get me what slots are in book car. Here are my slots. I just threw them out in their own field, right? So then here's the data. This is the metadata about the slot. So when I see from AWS that the next slot that I want is a pickup date, well, I dive into the list of slots and I say, this is the pickup date. Okay. So this right here is all the information that we need to render an accurate component in Unqork, right? So what we do is we take this data and we run it through that transformation process that we showed you for doing one-click transformations from Salesforce, ServiceNow, Airtable, so on and so forth, exporting that out, rendering that UI in Slack, all these other really cool codeless transformations we've shown you. We're just going to do the exact same thing here. Okay, so this is the data that we're going to pump into our transformation framework, which is then going to give us back the component that we want, right? So if we look at the network here, so the first thing we do is we say, let's send it that slot data. Right? Let's send it that slot data. Well, this is actually the manipulated version, right? Come on. Right. Okay. So here's the slot data, right? So this is the data I was just showing you a second ago, all the information about the slot. So we send this into the first method, which actually says, okay, I'm going to transform these properties into the appropriate properties that align with Unqork. Like, how do I map them, right? We've shown this mapping process before. Let's show it again. So the first thing we do, again, is we do that mapping. Okay. And inside that mapping, there's two flavors of mapping that we've done for all of it. So every time we demo another one of these transformations, this is where the bulk of the work belongs. Just defining the mapping between property IDs, right? So or properties. So for an AWS slot, they're going to call it this. We're going to take that description and we're going to make it the label, right? For the slot name, we're going to make that the key or the property ID of the component. For the slot type ID, that's going to be the type of the component. So Amazon city, Amazon date, custom room values. Slot type values. So if it was a custom slot type, which has options, then we're going to look in the slot type values. And then slot constraint is going to tell us whether or not it's required, right? So we look back at here, slot type ID, slot name, slot constraint, so on and so forth, and description. Okay, so that's the first thing we do is we normalize that to the terminology that Unqork understands. Okay. The other thing that happened in here is after we transform the properties, then we transform the types, right? So, wrong button. So if I go into my type data table, you'll see the same thing where I've said, okay, if it's a alphanumeric, well, then I want a string in Unqork. If it's a freeform endpoint, I want text. If it's an Amazon date, I want an Unqork date. If it's an Amazon number, I want an Unqork float. I chose float. In the case of nights, it's you're not going to stay for 3.5 nights, but Amazon doesn't discern the difference between a float or an integer. So I said, better to be safe than sorry and choose a float, which means I can use decimals, phone number, email, right? And then we get down here into some of the other ones where we're going to use strings for first name and last name. Then we're going to use street, city, country, and state, which as you might know, are not actually Unqork components, but they are now, to capture a street, city, country, date. And then there's still time, duration, and percentage. And in all honesty, I just haven't got around to building those out yet. But let's look at percentage as an example, right? What is percentage? Like Unqork, do we have a native percentage component? No. But if I just go into, if I come into my module builder and I drag in a number component, right? I have the ability to put in a suffix. It's a percent sign. So like now all of a sudden it's a percent, right? That was as simple as it is to make a number component or percent component. So what I probably will do here is I will, build a component type in Unqork called percentage, and I'll just make it a number component and I'll force in a suffix of that, right? Because this is effectively a percent component. Right on. Cool. So we've mapped out all these various types. Okay, cool. So that's it. And then, so now we have the mappings set up. And that's the first thing we do is send through the normalized version, the Unqork version. And then I pass that data into our transform API, which says, hey, build me this component. Right now, this isn't codeless JSON. This is a subset of everything that you need in the Unqork JSON to render it. But the response then is the Unqork component, right? With all the other fields that are part of a date component, which then I can render dynamically here. Okay, cool. So that we just basically do that. They tell us we need a pickup date. Okay, cool. Pickup date's a date. Boom, here's a date component, right? So we just do that every time we get that response from Amazon telling us what dialogue action, or basically what do you got to do next, right? And then we just shove that component inside of the plain text component. That's really it, right? And now for any component, any data type that exists in Lex, you're going to get an Unqork component as the response. Now, the one other thing I'll show, and then we'll wrap it up, is I use the address component to render a city, right? So when you configure an address component in Unqork, what you can do is you can do a few things. You can check any one of these boxes. Like, do I want, so as I'm typing, what parsed out data do I want, right? Because as you can see here, if I were to type in, let's go back to book a hotel. Let's get back to a location one, what city I was staying in, you see, right? Like if I choose Chicago Midway International Airport and Cicero Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, let's say that's where I want to go, it obviously pulls out just Chicago, right? So the Google Maps API gives you the full formatted string as well as each property of it. So if I come and look at my data that's sitting inside of this component, you'll see that it's actually rather complex, right? It did everything from storing the full formatted text, which is what appears in this, as well as parsing out the individual values. All right. Now, in this case, I only want the city, right? So this was, even though it's an address component, I said I just want the city. Now, when I hit send, you'll see it's only going to send the city. But if the data looked like this, how were we able to just pull out Chicago when if I were to just say, hey, shoot out, and now you can see text is Chicago, right? How was I able to just pull out Chicago rather than get the entire address, which obviously AWS won't understand if you try to shove it a stringified object of all of this, very valuable and useful address information, right? So what happens is when you check any one of these things that you want, that's how I'm determining which subtype of an address component you want. So when I was showing you this data mapping over here, and I said that the Amazon city maps to a city component. What a city component is it's basically just an address component with the city checked. Right? So that's a city component. Okay. And obviously this is a state component. Okay. So when you ask for a city, that's what we're rendering here. So if I come over to my network again, and I look at the last call that I got, it's still my data input. Why didn't it show me? Oh, it would be the second to last call. So it'll be the one up here. You will see that what I got back was an address JSON. So this is the JSON for the Unqork address component. And there's a property in it called city true, because that maps to the modal over here saying that you checked the box next to city. And then you could see that country is false, and state is false, and street is false, and street 2 is false. Right? So because I dynamically refreshed this panel over here with this JSON, that means that this JSON is available to me in the browser, right? So if I come back over to my console and I look at this property called component, you'll see that's exactly what I'm looking at, right? Is the definition. So this is the Unqork codeless definition for the address for a city component, okay? But it's just a JSON object. So because it's a JSON object, I can play around with it in configuration all I want, right? So now I'm able to make decisions on UI based on the definition of the component as well as the data of the component, right? So that's what's going to happen over here, where we basically say, hey, is the type of component that you just rendered an address component? If it is, then parse the data out here. Otherwise, just throw whatever the data is, right? So if there were other components in Unqork, I think our international phone number component also stores the data as an object. It gives you like the country code that it assigns to, and then it gives you the number, right? So like that might be another one that we'd have to build a slightly custom handler, because we don't just want to shove the entire data of the component out. We only want a sub property of the component. So that's where I dive into. You're going to love this data workflow. It's not as hard as it looks. And I probably should put some groups on it. And basically all it's doing is it's saying, okay, well, I'm going to look at the component. So this is the Unqork JSON that represents the component. And I'm going to look at the text. Okay. And I'm basically going to say, hey, I'm going to get the street. So I'm going to get the street property from the component. So what if I look back over here, in this case, street is false. So then I'm going to put it into this decision. I'm just going to say, look, the condition is arg. So the condition is true or false. It's very simple logic. If the value of this is true, then we're going to come out the top. And if the value of street is false, we're going to go out the bottom. So if it's street is true, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that the text that we're going to send is going to be a concatenation of the street and the street 2. So like 123 fake street, apartment 1, right? If street's not true, well, then let's check city, right? So now it says, is city true? If city is true, then just get the property of the city from the data and output that, right? So we're actually now able to blend data as well as the configuration of the component that generated the data in order to make decisions around how I actually want to parse out the data based on the settings of the configuration of the component. Stuff that I don't think we've really been able to do before a dynamic refresh, where you can really look at the JSON. Well, I guess you can do it. You could have done it before. You could have just made a call for the Unqork JSON via remote execute and then done it from there. But obviously, that's a lot of data. Now we're just being able to do it on a single component. Okay. And that's that. So that's how we figure out. And just one thing, because you see this text dynamic in text. What I'm doing here is because I need all of these components to logic components to work off the same inputs, right? So if I first got a component back, so if I look back at my network here, what I really got back was where's key? What I really got back was key location. Okay. So when I got back location, then the key was location because that was the name of the slot. When I got back check-in date, the key was called check-in date. So if I had just continued to shove this component in as is, it would be really hard. I wouldn't be able to figure out how to take it from the dynamic component and put it into the static component, like just the text that I want to send, right? So basically, I just need to normalize the name and standardize the name. So another super cool thing is when I do this call, so this is the plugin that's actually transforming, the light version of the JSON spec into the full featured codeless spec. When I get that back, I can actually, before I output it dynamically, I can manipulate it, right? So basically, what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, just change a field, change key to be dynamic, right? So I'm saying, all right, I'm going to get the component. So when you render dynamic refreshes, it always needs to be an array of components. Even if it's only one component, wrap it in an array. Okay. So I'm getting back my array of components and I'm just running a create field, which goes through every item within the array and updates a certain key in that index of the array to something different, right? So now there's only one, so it's only going to do it once, right? So I'm basically saying two things. I'm saying one, I want to change the key from whatever it was to text dynamic. So no matter what, because I don't care about the property ID in my UI. All I care about is getting that data to AWS. So I just call it text dynamic. So then all my other logic components just look for text dynamic. Right. And then over here is where I then just extract the first one and output it to the component, which is how I just have an object for the component that's rendered in there. And then again, that's what I use to do some of that special logic for the address. And then last but not least, before I almost forgot, is that data landed inside of Unqork, right? So what happened there was when Lex finished, you're allowed to basically hook into, I think, every single step of the conversation. But in our case, all we did was hook into the last step. So when they're done and they say yes, AWS is going to send us all of the information that they collected about the user. And then we're just going to build a simple little API that takes in the data. So this is location, check-in date, nights, and room type, right? These were the things that they checked. And then that's where I do things, right? That's where I say, okay, well, to get the checkout date, I just want to add the number of nights to the check-in date, and that's how I'm going to get the checkout date, right? For the price, I'm just going to multiply 150 by the number of nights. So then whatever other system, you need to build all that logic into Lex, right? And you might not even be able to build a logic into Lex, but you can leverage your own Unqork modules and workflows and so on and so forth to do it. So again, this is where I could, in theory, go process the reservation. But for simplicity's sake, I just store the data in Unqork, manipulating a little bit to show that you really can do whatever you want with the information that the bot collected from the end user for you. All right. So that's that. There it is. That is how. Oh, wait. I just switched back. Looks like we have a question. Yes. Okay. What happens if the bot or the user? Yes, I think I answered that for you in that it would hide one of those comments. So that's just kind of the thing where you just have to look at again. But the idea here is like what I've seen so far is with chatbots, it only really gives you one question and then gets a response. And because we're able to make the response smarter, then it's not going to really require a second request. And then secondly, multi-select pick list. Yeah, so this is something I haven't. Also, the question was, could you do a multi-select pick list? And in order for that to work, there actually is something I saw on AWS where you can define. Let me go grab the link off of another window that I have open because I keep all this stuff open, right? So what AWS has, I saw this documentation here, which says multi-value, multiple values in a slot. So they want multiple toppings on a pizza. So I haven't configured against that, but assuming, when you go to create the slot type, you say allow multiple values. Then what I would have done to say, maybe if you want, like for that example of what room type do you want, Unqork has a multi-select drop-down component. So if I saw, if I mark it as allow multiple values, that data is going to come through the AWS API to tell me that for this slot, multiple values are accepted, and at which point then I would transform that into a multi-select dropdown rather than a single select dropdown. So thank you for your questions. All right. Well, that's a wrap, folks. More to come probably with Lex over time and more of these AWS services and a lot of good stuff. So hopefully that was interesting and pretty cool. And reach out if you have a Lex bot and you're dying for a very slick UI on top of it. So thanks again for tuning in, and we will catch you next week, same time, same channel.